Next on the agenda is Ben Gardner and Colin Wood from AstraZeneca. And we've been able to get to know them over the past couple of years. Myself, Dave McComb, and Peter Winstanley have had some various collaboration sessions with them over the course of that time. And, you know, a lot of what we're hearing in today's, transformation ecosystem, and a lot of the seminars are bringing change to how businesses treat data. And it's interesting how AstraZeneca as an organization has really put a more or less a future stake in the ground to become 80% FAIR compliant by 2025. I think that's right, guys, or is it 2035? 2035. But with the help of Ben and Colin, scientists are really transforming information at AstraZeneca. So the stage is yours, Ben and Colin.
Thank you very much, Steve. So we're going to talk to you about the journey of really helping scientists explore information space and how we've been using knowledge graphs and FAIR data to bring those two things together to enable this to happen. We're going to talk about start small, think big. Stealing this from Dave and his approach, and some of the lessons learned. Now, just to set a little bit of the context around what we're talking about here, is the challenge that AstraZeneca is facing is that our science is continuously evolving. And this is a really good news story if we look, for example, at cancer and the way that we're now able to understand these diseases in much greater detail. So, at one time we just said people had cancer. Then we talk about the cancer of a particular organ. And then we're starting to look at, well, actually, there are different cell types within these organs. So there's non-small cell lung cancer. And then we're actually able to now start saying, well, this specific protein in this cell has this particular mutation. And if that's the case, we are confident that this class of drugs will actually give a positive benefit to the patient. And we talk about this as precision medicine. So it is medicine that is designed specifically for an individual. But to do this, we need to start to look at our data in much, much more granular details. So at one stage, we just looked at a clinical study and maybe we compared across clinical studies. Then we want to start looking at subjects and comparing across subjects within, not just within a clinical study, but across the clinical study. And then we start to get down to the sample from that subject. And so we're able to start saying, this subject has this particular mutation. Let's look at the pattern of their responses to these subjects, to drugs and to the different stages of the disease and how they respond. And that allows us to be able to have precision medicine. But to do that, we've got to connect our data at a fundamentally different level. And this is driving a data centricity at AstraZeneca. Our traditional systems are system centric, and information, as we all know, is fragmented across them. And we get bits of a clinical study in 4, 5, 6 different systems, and the business just had to go to all those systems to try and bring that picture back together. So what we're trying to do is to transform away from this system-centric world into this data-centric world, or a business concept-orientated world. And this is where we're bringing FAIR and knowledge maps together to achieve this. Now, Colin's going to talk to us first off about FAIR, so I'm going to hand over to him now.
Okay. All right, so FAIR is an absolute foundation for us as a framework for how we deliver integrated data. I'm not going to talk much about FAIR itself, right? So if you're not familiar, there are some links at the bottom of the page that do a far better job than I do. But it's very well aligned with scientific data, but it's about making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the thing to highlight is it's not just for people, it's for machines as well. So you have machine readable data that machines can interpret. That's the foundation of it. Now, the FAIR is absolutely wonderful. It's a great set of principles, but at the enterprise level, it's something that enterprise developers, engineers struggle to correctly interpret, right? And you'll find a lot of disagreement about how to interpret the principles. And that was one of the first things we put in place to try and change that. So if you go to the next slide, Ben, this is the framework we've put in across the organization. And it's really about transitioning ourselves from being very system-centric to being data-centric. Right? And the sweet spot where, so there was a mention about 80% fair. The sweet spot we're trying to go to is what we call level 4, domain level fair, where the data for one given domain it's conformed and integrated to a common data model. All right, so we can start to manage that data and integrate it within a domain. So if you think of clinical data, all that clinical data should connect together. All right, but there are other areas of fair levels we could go to. Right, you can get a certain level of benefit by just being system-centric and putting your data on a lake and cataloging it. Right, so we include that in our scorecards to try and drive us towards that domain level fair. And then much higher levels, and Ben will talk about this in just a minute, but when we're looking at deep scientific data, you want to really go beyond just being able to look in one domain. You want to be able to connect across the enterprise, and then you want to be able to connect to the semantics, is what we call knowledge level fair. All right, and the two things that underpin this, if you look at the bottom, there are some industry benchmarks. So look at those external frameworks. You can benchmark against those, but what we do internally is each one of these levels has a series of steps that you need to follow. So to get to level 4 fair, there are 12 things you need to do, and they're all being offered as enterprise services. So you can start to engineer this into solutions to build data products that are fair. There's more that you need to do to reach the higher levels, but that's the framework we're measuring against right now. If we go to the next slide, it's sometimes worth just telling the story about why why fair is important. This is just a little dialogue we put together to try and characterize the different levels. And it goes all the way from the bottom left-hand side, you've got the absolute junkyard, all right, where data's all over the place and you have to go and find out where it is. Where we're trying to go across the enterprise at the moment is really at the local market level, where you can go into a shopping area and you can find a set of products that are relevant to you, but it's not everything you could get to. Right, so that's really where we're trying to get to across the enterprise. Top right, it mentions Amazon Prime, but other retailers are available, I'm sure. But that is our ultimate aim to get to, is that kind of experience where all the data's at your fingertips and you can search for it, you can integrate it without having to do large amounts of work. So that's how the 6 levels fit together. You go to the next slide. All right, being enterprise IT though, we can never have enough frameworks. Data mesh has become the latest phrase, right? And it's something that is, it's being a little bit disruptive in the way we approach things, and it sometimes goes conflict to some of the ideas behind fair and data centricity. But very much we're driving our interpretation of data mesh as connecting the data together. So we build data products which connect together using common master data, common identifiers, so you can link the data across the enterprise. Now, if you go to the next slide. And so you can never have enough frameworks. And this is one I just want to highlight, is there's also a data management framework we have internally in AstraZeneca. It's called Trust, right? That's the business data governance framework. But you could not deliver fair data or even the data mesh without having that trust framework in place, right? So you want to avoid the situation where you integrate the data together, but the data itself isn't trustworthy or reliable, right? So you can't integrate it. So that's a core part of our framework as well. And if you go to one more slide, all right, and I thought I might get questions about this, so I did want to bring this up. I could give a whole talk just on this subject. Software as a service and external vendors is a constant problem when you go to this kind of architecture, because every time you're building a new solution, it's very much in the thinking behind data centricity. You've got to figure out what all this data means. All right, I could talk for hours about this, but this is one of the observations I've seen about how AstraZeneca approaches that. The top diagram there is just meant to show the amount of resource spent and where waste occurs. And a lot of people assume that when you bring in software as a service, you sprint and build a very quick solution, but then you suffer the effects that you have to, you have to expend. There's a certain level of waste to try and understand what that data means and to integrate it. All right, my experience of looking at these things, it's actually not like that at all. Is that when you put that software as a service system in place, a very large part of the work to bring it in place, particularly in a regulated environment, is to define and configure master and reference data. All right, given that that should already exist in your organization, that represents waste as well. All right, and we've got some rough metrics. I've seen 1 or 2 projects where 40% of that work is about, in that software as a service solution, is about configuring master and reference data. So I'd love to have some stories from others about how they've seen software as a service really work in enterprises. All right, but I think that's all my slides, Ben, and now you can tell a different story.
Thank you, Colin. So we've got this drive, as Steve mentioned, and you can see from the emphasis what Colin's working on, is that we want to move things to creating fair data products. So the idea that we have data as a consciously designed output rather than the exhaust fumes of a system is a huge enabler for what we want to do. If we think about building the knowledge map or the knowledge graph on top of it, it's so much easier if we have that. So what are we doing? Well, the first thing I'm going to say is we're trying to bring together data to help people navigate and explore information space. That's the driver here. And one of the first things we did at AstraZeneca was to say we're building knowledge maps. And it was really important to start to talk about this use of graph as a knowledge map, because there was another group who said we are building artificial intelligence and we are using knowledge graphs to infer insights. And we wanted to create a bit of clear blue water between those use cases to allow people to have the headspace to think about these things differently. It got us away from this whole conversation of there is only one knowledge graph. And so we talked about it in terms of knowledge map, this ability to explore, to allow people to go from concept to concept. And last year at this conference, Dan Gershwin from Amgen presented a lovely slide deck. If it's still available, I recommend you going and having a look at it. But he had this honeycomb motif in there. And we've adopted this as a way of starting to talk about what we're doing. So this motif allows us to show the concepts, the colors, and the links between them. And it's not really a picture of the, it's a cartoon of the knowledge graph that's sitting there, the knowledge map. But it allows us to have these conversations with the business about what's going on. So what we did with this whole start small or start small, think big conversation was we started with 3 different use cases. This one called Merlin, which was around helping improve the efficiency designing a clinical study. This deep medicine one, which is around that precision medicine story that I was telling you at the beginning. And this other one called Thrive, which was about translational medicine. So how do we translate what we see in the clinic through to what we see in the lab and vice versa? But what came out of this was when we started to look at the models, the graphs that we were putting together, the ontologies we were putting together, we start to see common motifs. This clinical study drug indication motif is found in all 3 of them. And what we started to say was, well, how can we build our ontologies so that they can be collapsed and evolve into together? So we start with 3 separate use cases. And where we are now is that we've managed to consolidate them back into a single ontological application. And where we're going this year is to expand that and add in extra hexagons, extra concepts around this space as we evolve it out. So it's been really key for us to have that fair data and then have a way that we can evolve our ontology, our knowledge graphs, so that we can move forward. And really at the center of that is what we refer to as our ontology architecture. I think actually it's probably resonated with what we were just hearing from Siemens and the idea there of creating a central ontology library. Well, we do a similar sort of thing in that we create these entity ontologies. Now, when we started, we had lovely conceptual models that the information architecture group led by Colin had been making, and these are really powerful, but they are a bit trapped in IDEA or whatever your enterprise modeling tool is, in that they're a conceptual model, and we heard being talked about, Dave talked about the conceptual model, the physical model, and the logical model. Well, we took from here and said, oh, look, there are lots of lovely entities here that we know we're going to need. Why don't we just produce small ontologies that describe each of those entities? And that these could be building blocks that could be imported from a common set of pieces of Lego, if you like, into an application ontology. And then we have the application ontology. We then use this honeycomb motif as a way of a communication device. So where we're going, I like to think, is that we've started with these lovely conceptual models, and where we're starting to move towards is being able to create application ontologies that represent a conceptual model. And along the way, we are building up a library of these entities so that the next group that comes along can pick the entities that they want, import them into their application ontology, and take advantage of it. And so what are these entity ontologies? It's really a set of instructions. So we have a namespace, in this case, clinical study. We have some good metadata, as all good ontologists should. We describe the history of the entity, who wrote it, where it was serviced from, which version it is, etc. We then have a indication, we list off the controlled vocabularies that should be used in this namespace. We define the relationships, and that's the relationships between this entity and its nearest neighbors, but also to subclasses that might exist within this concept. And finally, we have data bindings. And what we do here is we say, for the properties that we are currently using, here is the path for you to go and get that information. So this is an instruction set that you can then pull into your application ontology, and it includes the data bindings in there for you to take advantage of, so you know where to go and get that information. So what is actually happening here? So Colin talked about the data mesh architecture. We have the business processes at the bottom. We have the applications that have been built historically to automate those processes. And then what we're starting to do is to create these fair data products that sit across the applications of a particular information domain. And they start to create products that can be consumed, and we map those things together through the graph. So if we think about it, at the bottom here, we're system-centric. It's aligned around process. In the middle here, we have a platform, and we have an omics, so your gene sequences, your protein expression, etc. We have images, so this could be your MRI scans or your histopathology staining of your particular cancers, and here we have the clinical observations. Now, if we look in each platform, what we see is that there is a bit of the concept of a clinical study in each of those. And so from the business perspective, the data here is platform centric, but it's still not completely, in terms of the concept that I want to do. So it's not really the clinical study, it's just bits of the clinical study. So we effectively use these entity ontologies to pull those fragments together from the platforms into a consistent whole to allow people to explore that information space by the concepts they want to. So we've pivoted here from application-centric through to knowledge-centric or data-centric by going through this faiриfication process and taking advantage of someone, the platform teams doing all the lifting for us to get that data fair. And if we can push them to the level 5 at the least, then what we've got there in terms of our scoring metrics is we have data with URIs and common shared vocabularies in them. So it becomes a lot easier for us to then connect things together. So what does this really let us do? And I hope I'm speaking very much to the converted here. It's allowing us, our scientists, to explore the information space. And so we can start to ask these precision medicine questions. You know, which patients are most likely to benefit from this drug and not gain resistance? And once we've asked that question, it triggers a new question in the mind of our scientists. Now, we use a particular interface to allow us to search it. It's a semantic search platform, and it looks like provides a very rich environment for them to do that. But once they've asked that question, you can then start to pivot into new questions across the same data. So I've asked, you know, what subjects don't show resistance to a particular develop resistance to a particular drug. Well, then the question goes, well, what biomarkers are associated with patients who have that profile that might be indicative of you being able to screen them and say, you have this marker, right, you are likely to be able to benefit from this drug without developing resistance. So this one is the best choice for this drug for treating you. And then we could go from there to asking, okay, well, what sort of investigators, so which physicians in clinics and so forth around the world are treating patients with those sorts of profiles? And that's allowing us to then explore that aspect. So we've moved from identifying subjects who can benefit from the drug to identifying the practitioners who we can engage with in designing that clinical trial and to help with the recruitment of the right patients onto that clinical trial. And that's by exploring the information space. So the core learnings that we've got from this, well, it takes an ecosystem to do this. If you want to build an enduring capability, and I've in the last 12, probably too many years thinking about it, built too many POCs. And what I'm really interested in now is building an enterprise strength solution. So how do we move from being able to do this just as a small group, as a small project, to actually build the skill sets, the tools, the infrastructure, the governance processes, the use cases, the training material and the roadmaps that go with this. And we're doing this based around fair data, but it's about understanding the skills that we need and recognizing that we need all of these things to move forward together. It's not just about building one thing. We've got to move each one. And, plugging a bit of a skills gap is really great. Adding some infrastructure is really great. But it's about celebrating those steps of the whole and not focusing on one. So sort of the key messages that we get from here is, the fair data journey is moving us to being data-centric. It is enabling us to be so much easier to work with data. When I started 2 years ago, we picked up data sources and we had to do effectively that verification before we could even start thinking about joining the data together. Now, we have groups now that are focusing on, just getting that data fair. And so I am able to focus on joining things together. So we're now sharing that effort to make that transformation. Showing that the knowledge maps can deliver new opportunities, improve productivity has been absolutely key. So there's no real difference there. It's about showing the business, showing our IT colleagues as well that by taking this different approach, we can make that transformational change and we can enable people to do things that were different. So we use these honeycombs, this whole data-centric story as that North Star that's guiding us. So we're starting with small use cases, but we're looking to evolve the way that we're bringing that data together, not do waterfall upfront design. So all of our approaches are bottom-up modeling, they're use case driven, and we evolve and we expand and we grow in an organic fashion. And the challenge that we have is how do we evolve from a cottage industry, a project-centric approach to trying to do all of this, to building an enduring capability in IT. So the things I'm really interested in is, how do you minimize that dependency on semantic engineering? How do we convince and take a relational engineer and bring them into what is a very different and a new world and help them to embrace it so that we can work together, because this isn't about replacing relational solutions. I don't believe that's the case. I believe this is an and situation, and we've got to work out how we blend these tools together as we go on this journey. So I've just got the last slide here is just an acknowledgement. Thank you to all the people who participated to have made this possible. And you can see it involves the groups across the whole business. There are groups within IT here. There are participants from within the business, from the R&D scientific community. But it's about bringing everyone together to tackle this. It wasn't about doing one thing at all. So I hope that has been interesting to you, and I think we're over to asking you questions. So please use either the Q&A or raise your hand, and I'm sure Steve or James will step in to speak to us.
Yeah, we've got a hand from Sandra here. Go ahead.
Yes, I teach information governance for the University of Washington in Seattle in their public health graduate school. And I'm trying to introduce these ideas because previously it was mostly, the course ahead of mine is mostly relational databases and things like that. But I wanted to know, what I'm trying to do a lot with my students is what kinds of skills are you looking for in terms of, you were talking about in that one visual about the skills gaps that you need to fill. What should my students, I'd say about 2/3 of my students are clinical people. The other third is, or information management people. The remaining third is IT people. And so what skills should I be promoting for them?
I kind of break it down into 3 pillars. I describe it as the ontologist who's going to be doing, deep ontological modeling, working with OWL, for example, and building out those the ontologies, the high level. And then we see a vocabulist, and this is a really important skill here about creating the reference data, the controlled vocabularies. We're using SCOS as the framework for doing that. And these are the people who are translating that language into that controlled vocabulary that we can then use, and we can provide back to the people who are doing curation. So there's always going to be a need for curation of putting those vocabularies back into the source systems to make that data fair. And then finally, we need engineers who can create RDF serialization to bring those things together. And those are the 3 pillars, as I see it, that allow us to bring this together. So if you want to know the skills, it's not necessarily being a master across the entire information stack, but we need those 3 different skills, as I see it, to be able to bring this together. And if you want a particular one, always add Sparkle to that list, because just being able to query it natively is important. Though what we've got to do to make it work in the enterprise is to allow people to write SQL queries against this, I believe. So, we've got to meet the other half of the world somewhere.
Yeah, I'll add one more, and tell me, Ben, if you already covered it, but it's some of the data governance capabilities in terms of monitoring process and data quality as well. All right, so this has been a problem. I mean, a lot of the FAIR community have realised this without an ongoing data governance program to put in the processes to maintain the data in the right way. You find that your data suddenly isn't fit for purpose anymore because you don't have the teams, the people involved to ensure that the data even maps together. So you think about those ontologies mapping together, right? If nobody's managing it, you've got no connections.
So, yes, I think the data integrity piece, well, I have a speaker that talks about identity management and particularly patient identity management, and that's kind of the key to the kingdom. If you don't have good patient identification, it's hard to hang everything else together. So we do that, but I felt like that some of the previous courses emphasize a lot of that, but I wanted to get what you all are doing is wonderful. I wanted to get that to my students because these are people in their 20s that are going out into the world now, and I want them to be familiar with what that world's going to look like. So,
well, we need them. There aren't enough people, and I think it was said earlier in one of the talks, we need more people who have these skills, and we're born thinking differently. Or I think Ola Lasser says, no one was taught to think in third normal form. It's something that you learned to do, and you forgot how to think in graph where you started. Right?
Yes, I just finished a second master's with it's Dr. Marcia Zhang at Kent State, and it was more devoted to, I did do RDF and all of that sort of stuff, but more devoted to, the kinds of people that do publications and manage, massive newspaper clippings and literature, and actually she does a lot of managing art in terms of art objects in museums and things like that. So, but I think I saw this. I have 40 years in healthcare. I saw this as such a gift. So
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. There was actually a follow-up in the Q&A to this one here. I'll put it up. I'm going to follow up on that.
If one person's trying to do all of this, I don't know. That's if you've got the skills across this space, do it. I mean, let me take me as an example, right? I'm a bench scientist. The last time I cut any code was actually programming a liquid handling robot in a lab. I can't do. I can't program. It's not the skill set that I've focused on. So, how do I do this when I need to go outside? Well, in the past, I've gone and worked with, a set of experts, worked with a small consultancy to help build that POC, to generate that belief in it. And then your question then comes is, how do I take that POC and make sure it becomes an enterprise solution that is robust enough and maintainable? And that's your challenge, and this is the challenge that we're going through as well. That how do I move from a project to an enduring capability? And that's a journey we're on, and that's what we're exploring.
Another one on there that I'll bring up.
Yeah. Tell us about the journey of getting to this point. Well, 2.5 years ago when I joined AstraZeneca, there was some really nice work that had been done by a colleague of ours called Tom Plasterer, who had been looking at RDF and graph approaches, and he'd built a very nice system. The trouble was that it wasn't. It had been built in the business, so it had been built by R&D scientists, and it couldn't be adopted back into the IT infrastructure. It was just too alien, and the design decisions that had been made weren't compatible really with the way the IT was structured. So what we've had to do is, in some respects, go back and look at how that was done, and to take that POC and start to turn it into an enterprise robust solution. And so it's this continuous piece. We have work that Tom had done around verification of data and around controlled vocabularies and using tools to do NLP, named entity recognition, to help with those activities. He'd looked at virtualization and federation of concepts, of queries. We had some other data where people had used a virtualization technology. I think it's Cisco information server, or some of us may remember it in its older days as Composite, but it's a relational virtualization technology. And what they've done with that is to create, well, essentially data products around clinical studies. So you could say, this is the list of the clinical study, this is its identifiers, and here are the synonyms for it. And similarly around drugs. So we had these two very nascent master data systems, but were lovely, fair data, but it was relationally designed. And so it didn't have the relationship between the study and the drug really built into it. And we had a data lake, which is evolving into this data mesh, and we're building more sophistication in there. But what we were doing was combining those different elements from those 3 different pieces and bringing them together. And this is the same journey that we're still going on. And as Colin says as well, right to remind me, we're also building data governance around this to reinforce this whole journey of, make the data fair, make it fair so it's reusable, so it doesn't just benefit Ben and his crazy crew who are doing this knowledge graph stuff, but actually it benefits everyone as well. So, Colin, I don't know if you wanted to add to that in terms of the evolution.
Yeah, it is a long journey. All right, if you want to do this in the enterprise, right, there are a lot of components that you need to put in place and scale up. So things like data catalogs, right? So that's absolutely a foundational part of finding data in the first place, right? So it's a foundation of FAIR, right? But that's quite a lot of work to put together a single enterprise data catalog where you can, advertise you have these data products in the first place. And even that's a moving target because the concept of data product is only just made it into the enterprise data catalogs, right? So tools like Calibra, which we're using, right? It's only just become a first class object in Calibra, right? But there's a whole series of things like that when you try and do this, right? Because if you think about things like reference and master data, what you really want to be able to do is to get your data when you collect it, reflecting the identifiers and ultimately the URIs that you want to bring forward into a graph environment. And there's quite a lot of investment you need to put in place to make that work. All right, I haven't even mentioned Perl servers. All right, Perl servers, right? That's the other bit that you need, right? So there's a chunk of infrastructure you need to really make this all work. So it's not, if you want to do it at an enterprise scale, right, it's a multi-year activity.
Great. Got another question here.
Yeah. So my short answer is no, though I suspect that if I was in a different part of the business doing this, then that might be the case. So maybe more in the what we refer to as enabling units of finance, or in the commercial end of the organization, that may be the case, that we can use the, mine out the business reports for these things. The sort of reports we deal with, maybe in abstract, the answer is yes. I don't know. We deal with clinical studies, is that our situation. And we have the raw data and we have the documents that were written for the submission to the regulator. So we have both of those. I think it's fair to say we've focused very much on the structured data that we have access to, but there have been small examples where we are trying to mine the unstructured content as well. So it's about bringing those two things together and trying to find the way to achieve this. So I think the point being made is a good one. You need to look for where's the right place to pull the data that you need to answer the set of questions from, and just make sure that if you're going to use the unstructured content, recognize that it may well actually differ to what was the actual data that was collected, and that can be the risk sometimes. Hopefully not around a clinical study report, but certainly in a more academic publication, I would suggest there can be bigger risks around those sorts of things. The interpretation can be difficult to mine out, if you like. Maybe one for you, Colin.
Yeah, I can take this. Yes, it is available for reference outside of AstraZeneca. I can give a plug for a team I'm involved in, FAIR Plus, right? Which is an IMI, so European Union funded activity. It's in the public domain. You can go and search that. Some of the content we've shared today has been shared with FAIR Plus. and that's being used to build frameworks, right? So FAIR Plus has a whole framework, including a maturity model, right? And it will be available there. So I'd actually go look at FAIR Plus as a place to investigate that.
Great. And looks like we've got a follow-up question from Sandra. Go ahead.
Yes, I was interested when you were talking about doing some with unstructured data, because we actually, my organization, which is actually the biggest healthcare organization in New Mexico, partially started down this path with unstructured, because we found that our clinicians, our nurses and stuff during our accreditation surveys couldn't find documents. And we got fined for not being able to find the appropriate latest procedures or protocols or whatever. So I think that's a domain that is somewhat unexplored in terms of the library they have now there. They call it their electronic library, has 250,000 different protocols and procedures, and they've standardized all the regional hospitals and the central hospital so that there's a whole process for doing that. And that's all unstructured content, because that's really where they actually got some pain in that area. So
Sandra, there is a huge value in that unstructured content. We cheat a little bit in that we take advantage of the requirement to publish all clinical studies to sites like clinicaltrials.gov, and because the whole industry publishes their studies there, we then have competitor intelligence vendors who take that and convert it into semi-structured XML form. And it's often easier for us to purchase the data back from a competitor intelligence vendor and work with that semi-structured data rather than have to work from scratch with the unstructured data. So we spend money to get access to our own information in this convoluted way. Actually, we then obviously pull in data from all of our competitors as well. So it's not quite so complete madness, but yeah, you're right. There's a huge value in there. And how do you get at it? The issue sometimes, though, is you run into the data sits in tables, and trying to extract a visit schedule from from an unstructured data source is almost impossible. I've seen data scientists lose their hair trying to solve that problem. So the other side of FAIR that we didn't talk about, though, is that having constructed our reference architecture, the reference ontologies, we can use those same vocabularies to push back into our creating of the documents. So they're no longer unstructured documents. We create them as FAIR documents as well. And that's another side of things that I think is going to become more and more fruitful and a really interesting area to be working in the coming years.
Okay. Is there particular vendors that are specializing in helping people to do that?
Well, I think we can look at in the healthcare industry, this Transcelerate is a collaboration, again, across many pharmaceutical companies that are trying to look at how do we create structured protocols, because it will make it far easier to mine the data, but also to create the the procedures and the checklists for the clinicians in the actual clinic to actually run the trials as well. So there's this huge benefit of having the whole ecosystem become structured rather than it just having unstructured content that we use to transfer information between groups.
That's great.
Thank you, JT. Well, and thank you again, Ben and Colin. I know this subject is very passionate for both of you, and I would say one of the things that we didn't tap on was just the patience level of being involved in such a complex organization, that's going through change and organizational change, and those are elements that definitely cause stops and starts along the way too. So kudos to you both for hanging in there and pushing forward with the data-centric vision.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for the opportunity to speak as well.